What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. Just wanted to remind you guys before we start this video that from this week onward we will be returning to the previous normal schedule. That means that every video during the week will be new scary stories except for the one on Sunday, which will be the weekly compilation of every story read previously that week. If you guys are enjoying these daily true scary stories, please be sure to like, share, comment, or subscribe if you feel so inclined. Doing all of those really helps the channel to succeed and ensure I can keep making these daily videos for a long time to come. If you guys have any thoughts about the stories in this video, please be sure to leave them in a comment below, as I do read all of your guys' comments, even if I don't often get the chance to respond to them. Without further ado though guys, I will let you enjoy the next hour of true scary stories, and I will see you guys again at the end of the video. This happened to me when I was 16. I decided to do something over the summer break, just so I wouldn't get bored. My dad had offered me to house sit for one of his co-workers while she was away on some business. I agreed and my dad made the arrangements. He said that I would get paid $200 for the 5 days that I'd be house sitting for her. Seemed like a pretty good deal to me. On that Monday, my dad dropped me off at around 7:30 in the morning. His co-worker was in a real rush, so she had to briefly explain where everything in the house was, then took off in a cab right toward the airport or wherever it was she was going. At first, I didn't really feel that bored at all. The house was fun to be in, and she also had a cute dog, which was a plus as well. I really love animals. I guess the main reason she needed someone to help sit for her was to take care of her dog, a small Maltese by the name of Ivy. I played some video games that she had in the living room, then took Ivy for a walk around the block a few times. I watched some scary videos on my laptop as well, before I decided to order some Chinese takeout for dinner. After dinner, I went back to watching some more scary videos in the guest room, where I'd been sleeping. The next few days were uneventful mostly. I spent some time with Ivy, played some video games, cooked and cleaned the house, and so on. I wanted the house to be clean when the owner returned. It was a Thursday night when this event happened. The next day, Friday, my dad's co-worker would be returning. I finished my dinner that night and washed the dishes. I also wiped down the counters and the stove as well, and made sure Ivy had all the food and water she'd need. I then retired to the guest room and watched some videos in bed once again. It was around 11:30 or so when I suddenly heard a car pull into the driveway. Needless to say, I was very confused. Nobody should have been arriving at this time. Not the owner, and definitely not the mailman either. I paused the video I was watching, and then listened to the sound of very heavy footsteps making their way up to the front door. A series of loud bangs rang out. Someone was aggressively pounding against it now. My heart began to pound furiously in return. I guess I only thought this could happen in scary movies, but at that point I found myself in my own scary story. The banging on the door paused, and an angry man's voice called out, "Open up, Jenny! I know you're in there! Open the door now!" The pounding resumed. Jenny was the house owner's name, and this man was clearly looking for her. I wondered why. I thought about the information my dad had given me about her, and I remembered that he had mentioned she had an ex. Could this crazy guy outside be that very same ex? "Open the door right now, Jenny!" The man outside roared again. "Open it, or I'll do it for you, and you won't like it if I do." My heart began to pound even harder. I felt as though I couldn't move. I knew I'd have to, though. I slowly crept out of the guest room and slipped on my shoes and jacket, which I'd luckily left right by the back door. Outside, I could hear the man clearly cocking back the hammer of a gun. I crept back to the guest room and picked up the trembling Ivy. She whined and I stroked her head to keep her quiet. All of a sudden, a few shots rang out. I knew that if the man fired enough bullets into the door, he'd either break it open or one would hit me and I'd be dead. I picked up my phone from the nightstand and dialed out 911. After briefly explaining to the operator what was happening, I also called up my dad, who was luckily still awake. I told him about the situation, and he said he'd come over as soon as possible. As soon as I tucked the phone into my pocket, I heard the gut-wrenching sound of the doorknob falling to the floor and the door opening. He got in, or so I thought. I silently closed and locked the guest bedroom door before making my way to the window. I opened it. The guest room was on the first floor, so I could easily escape out the window unharmed. That was if the crazy man didn't catch me first and shoot me to death. I climbed out of the window with Ivy in my arms and began to run away as fast as my trembling legs would allow me. As I began to move away from the house, to my absolute horror, I heard this crazy guy screaming from behind me, "Hey, stop!" Before I knew it, he was chasing me. I was squealing in terror as I ran. I was determined not to end up on the news as a dead teenage girl. I ran for what felt like hours, all while hearing the man firing his gun wildly from behind. He must have been a really terrible shot, because honestly it was a miracle that I was not injured. The cops arrived just as I tripped over my own shoelaces and fell forward onto the pavement. The cop cars were followed soon after by my dad's car. My dad rushed forward and grabbed me. I hugged him tight and hugged Ivy as well. I turned to see officers confronting and handcuffing that man. That night, my dad spent time with me in his coworker's house, along with an officer who volunteered just to make us feel a bit safer, I guess. When morning came, my dad's coworker arrived, and upon hearing everything that happened, she paid me $500. She also gave me extra for keeping her dog safe. To this day, I'm so grateful I had the ability to get away. I really believe that it all came from all the scary stories I've watched, giving me the experience I needed to get out of that situation. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if my dad's coworker hadn't gone on her business trip, though. I feel like she may have been killed. I really hope not, though. As a teenager, I waited tables in the local restaurant to pay for the gas for my car. I met Mr. Creep there. In my naive mind, he seemed fairly normal at first, despite the fact that he was over 20 and constantly insisting on wanting a date with a teenager like me. Leaving my job after dark scared me a lot, so I taught myself to get into my car, shut the door, and lock it in one fluid motion. I even practiced it quite a bit. It made me feel much safer. One night, I was leaving work and had just climbed into my car when Mr. Creep seemed to just appear out of nowhere. He yanked on my door handle to try and open it. I looked into his eyes in the split second before he smiled, and what I saw absolutely chilled my bones. I don't know how to describe the evil that I saw. I just know that it looked like he wanted to eat me. From then on, I was terrified of him, but I didn't let on. I was afraid of what he might do if I told him that I never wanted to see him again directly. When I tried to tell other people about what he'd done, he constantly lied. He also tried to impress me and invent ways of being alone with me. My instinct was always to run, though. I did my best to avoid him however I could. About 2 weeks after this incident, the restaurant got robbed. There was significant evidence against Mr. Creep, just not the kind that allowed the cops to charge him. I sent all my text messages with Mr. Creep to the police chief in hopes that it would help him get caught. He slithered away after that, but I always looked over my shoulder. About 5 years ago, he suddenly messaged me on Facebook out of the blue. He went on and on about this top-secret military clearance he had and this huge acreage that he owned. It made me nervous. I felt like he was trying to drag me into a trap or something. I just tried to put it out of my mind and blocked him. Today, I was looking at some posts about an unsolved murder when I saw his mugshot. He's now facing murder charges, as well as 2 other violent felony charges. I'm glad to know that he's being locked up finally, but I feel overwhelmed about how correct my instincts ended up being about this guy that I worked with. I thought I would share a story from my past that for some reason has made a resurgence recently and become a very unwelcome guest in my mind. Perhaps sharing it will help me get over it once and for all. The year was 1986. I was 16 at the time. I was in Indianapolis at Union Station. It was around Christmas time or just after. I was with my mom, my 2-year-old sister, and my 21-year-old uncle. At this time, my uncle still lived in Indianapolis, while the rest of us lived in southwest Indiana. We were getting ready to leave and drive back home. It was very cold out that day. I was bundled up in my jacket, scarf, and gloves. My mom, God rest her soul, could talk a dead man back to life, so I was just waiting for her long-winded wrap-up. It was getting hot standing inside the station wearing all that clothing, so I told her I was getting a bit warm and that I was going to step out for a minute. My mom nodded and continued with whatever story she was telling. I went out and it was fairly cool, but there was no snow or fierce winds or anything. Just perfect for me to cool down for a bit. Not even a minute or so after standing outside, though, right by the double doors, a white Chevrolet pulled up. 2 big men with crew cuts were sitting in the driver and passenger seats. They were at least 6 feet tall and looked to be about 280 pounds each. I figured they must have been some people from our local military base, but that was just an assumption. Immediately after seeing me, they stopped at the curb, rolled down the window, and gave a big smile. "Hey, come here. I want to talk to you," the passenger said. Bear in mind, I was very visibly 16. If this were to happen to me today, things would be much different, but as a kid, I was very polite, to the point of being docile. I was always very apologetic when I thought I'd screwed up in some way. I looked up and saw a streetlight above me. I looked back at them and started apologizing. At that moment, it was more amusing to me than anything. I hadn't really considered I was in any kind of danger yet. They kept reiterating that they just wanted to talk to me, and I tried to explain to them that I was not some street girl. This was not what it looked like. I was sorry for giving them the wrong impression. It didn't occur to me that they wouldn't listen to a word that I was saying. All of a sudden, the passenger shot open his door and started charging toward me, like a hungry dog chasing after a T-bone steak. A switch went off in my head. I was no longer apologetic or embarrassed. I was just pissed now. I yelled at him, "You don't have to get out of your car if you just want to talk to me. I can hear you just fine from here." I suddenly found the Scandinavian heritage on my dad's side was coming out in full force. The towering, hulking man was still coming right towards me, though. I bolted back inside for my mom, who was still yammering away. Upon seeing me, my uncle and mom felt immediately alarmed. They hadn't seen the man emerge from his car, but they could tell that I was clearly frightened. I told them what happened, and my uncle asked what they were driving. I said a white Chevrolet. My mom then cut in. "Go get him." My uncle bolted out the door and down the street, chasing after that car. He even yelled at them, "You sons of bitches, get the hell out so I can bust your teeth in." My mom was livid, but I could tell my baby sister was getting upset. I tried talking her down. My uncle came back in a few minutes later, winded and worn out. He said that he'd almost caught up with them, but when they got to the traffic light at the end of the block, they just ran it and peeled out. That all put a major damper on our trip to Indianapolis. The moral of this story is, ladies and gents, don't allow your good manners to supersede your own safety. Fuck that noise. Who wants to die because they're being polite? Something really disturbing has been going on. It's really become a problem for me. Every Tuesday at around 2 a.m., I began to hear the sounds of a man laughing, and that laughter really creeped me out. I struggled to get to sleep whenever I heard it. It became such a problem that I asked a friend of mine to come over on a Tuesday night. I think I just wanted her to hear it as well, so I could prove I wasn't having a mental episode or something. Honestly, I'd started to question my own sanity. It was not nice to be alone at night when 2 a.m. approached. On this night, I was somewhat nervous that we wouldn't actually hear the laughter. I was scared I would be called a liar by my friend, or that there was really something wrong with me in my head. But we heard it right on cue. It came at exactly 2 a.m. My friend is, what's the kindest way to phrase this? A very headstrong person. She's quite pushy and she likes to get things done. So when she heard that laughter outside, she wanted to do something about it. Who wants to live with that anyway? She headed straight out the door, and I followed on behind her. You might be thinking that what I was hearing was laughter coming from a neighbor's apartment through the walls, or from somewhere above or below me. But that was not the case. I was hearing this eerie laughter from outside, coming from the street below my apartment. It was as if someone was periodically turning up and laughing at something each week on the street outside. It sounds completely insane, I know, but stick with me. We headed out the door and down the steps to the street below. I was really nervous, to be honest with you. I didn't know why we had to go and directly confront the owner of this laughter when we should probably just call the police or something. But I also needed this to be over. I felt conflicted. We went to the bottom of the stairs, and we turned to face the direction this sound was coming from. It was super dark out, but that was pretty normal since it was late September when this happened. Immediately, we saw a figure beneath a dim street light. That figure turned to face us as we approached, and I finally saw who I dubbed the Laughing Man. He was a middle-aged man, or at least he appeared to be. We slowly approached him, and as we got closer, I could make out more and more of his features. The man had this absolutely insane-looking smile on his face. Right in front of us, he began to cackle that signature 2 a.m. laugh. My friend could be headstrong, but she was not stupid. She grabbed my arm and proceeded to flip me around toward the other direction. We began to run back toward my apartment. I knew it was a bad idea to come and confront this guy. I was planning on letting her know all about it as soon as we were behind a closed and locked door, but something else happened before that could. I heard a sudden flurry of footfalls approaching. We began to run even faster. It felt as if my legs were made of jelly. That's how hard we were running. I could hear the man gaining on us. I felt as if I wasn't moving quick enough, and I was going to be caught by him. Why the hell did we have to go and provoke this wacko? My friend and I got separated, and we both raced in opposite directions. I heard the guy take off after her. I was relieved that he wasn't right behind me, but I also felt terrified for my friend. I couldn't even see either of them. By the time I turned around, I was all alone on an empty street in the dark, feeling more scared than I ever had before. I figured my friend would come back to my apartment if she could, so I thought my best move would be to make it back to my place and wait for her while grabbing my phone. I was really frightened. I got on the phone with police. I must have sounded like an absolute nutter. They wouldn't even take my call seriously. It's rough reporting things here if you're young. I know that sounds like an excuse, but it isn't at all. I felt strange about those moments. The feeling of relief that the laughing man wasn't chasing me, wasn't near me. It felt as if a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I felt guilty for feeling like that when I knew my friend was still in danger. I was really worried for her. I got a message from my friend about 10 minutes after I got off the phone with the police, though. She'd run all the way home and was safe behind a locked door, thankfully. She only lived about a 15-minute walk away, so I was glad she was okay. For some reason, I got the eerie feeling the man had decided to target her now instead. Any day now, I'm waiting for her to say she's started to hear laughter in the middle of the night, too. I just hope he doesn't know where she lives. I never want to run into that guy again. He was terrifying, and now I'm scared to even walk the streets at night. My name is Rose. I'm 5 foot and I'm 38 years old, but I don't even look it. I was a very sick newborn. I even died twice. I have physical and mental disabilities as a result of this. I was in special needs classes during most of my schooling. Names will be changed because I don't want these people this story involves to find me. I'm from Alabama, born and raised. I'm on disability because of my health problems, and I can't really work anymore. Because of that, I've been on YouTube ever since it was created. This started happening to me on one of my newer accounts. I'm not a huge YouTuber or anything like that. I never really looked at it as a job, but more as something fun to do. I have a lot of different interests, and I'm also a Christian. I wanted to use my channel to teach about Jesus. I felt as if I had a calling to do so. I would read out some King James Bible verses and explain what they were about. Well, this one lady really took offense to this. Let's call her Abby. She had apparently misunderstood what I was trying to say. It enraged her so much that she went out of her way to discover my personal Facebook, which wasn't linked to anything, and my Instagram. It was really weird. Just because of one thing she didn't like, she started to threaten to ruin me. She even threatened to come to my house in her van. I tried to make things right and apologize, but it was no use. I couldn't be on that YouTube account anymore. Not even my main YouTube channel, actually. No matter what account I switched to, she would always find me no matter what. It was getting real bad. That had started in the summer, but new stuff began to happen all the time. This past November, actually, I even had someone come and bang on my front door after Thanksgiving. December, I had someone try to break into my home and jiggle the doorknob. It was insane. It all stopped at that December. More recently, someone tried to add me on Instagram with a fake account, but I realized right away it was my stalker. I recognized all of the pictures she had on said account. I had mine set to private because there are a lot of sick creeps out there. All of my profiles are set to private, actually, and I don't add anyone unless I know them, so I had no idea where she was getting all this information from. My friend, who I'll call Mary, wanted to know how this all even started. By this point, it was all playing a huge deal on my mental health. I explained everything that happened and went on my friend's account. We found a bit more information, and it turned out that this person wasn't even who they said they were. It was a woman and her husband that used the same account. They were both in on it. I've never met these people in person at all, nor really even shared a single word with them, other than them threatening me. I thank my friend for helping me discover that information, and made some new accounts. I then blocked everyone involved. I'm no longer doing YouTube, and I try to stay out of the public eye. It stressed me out way too much. I used to sing on that channel as well, doing some cooking videos too, but right now I'm just trying to have some peace. Be careful who you interact with online. They may not have the intentions you think they have. Stay safe out there and always watch your surroundings, whether it's in real life or online. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to my story. For most of my childhood, my family and I lived one house away from a child predator. For the sake of the story, I'll just call him Mr. Stan. Our old neighborhood started at the top of a hill and went down to a small lake where the road turned right and branched off into a CAC and another residential road. Mr. Stan's house was at the top of the hill and ours was in the middle. Mr. Stan lived in the neighborhood long before we moved in. It's hard for me to remember any vivid details about him, as I was very young at the time. What I do remember, though, is that every time he saw us, his face would scrunch up as if he smelled something terrible. There was only one house between his place and ours, but that one house was something I'm very grateful for. I don't know what my life would have been like if we had him living right next to us. Right from when we were little, my parents were very strict about walking past Mr. Stan's house. They insisted that Mr. Stan was sick in the head, and if he ever asked us to come into his home, we were never allowed to do so by ourselves. For years, no one told us exactly why Mr. Stan was a bad guy, but we didn't need to know all the details. We just knew to avoid him. The look he gave us whenever he was working on his car or planting flowers in his garden was enough to unnerve my sister and I. Whenever my sister and I would walk up the hill to school, we would cross the street even when we got to his place, just to stay as far away from him as possible. Like I said, I don't remember very much about Mr. Stan. His twisted story began long before I was even born. For this, I turned to my mom to fill in the details. My mom said that before we'd ever moved into the cul-de-sac, around the late 70s and early 80s, Mr. Stan had already gotten the reputation of being a heavy drinker. He would get drunk and go over to the house of the family right across the street from us to do terrible things to their daughter while she was babysitting. The daughter tried to tell her mother about it, but since she was a rebellious child, her mother didn't believe her. Her family and Mr. Stan's family were actually good friends. Mr. Stan even worked as a corrections officer. Soon, more accusations surfaced, though. Mr. Stan and another officer apparently regularly touched their co-workers' kids. Mr. Stan was able to avoid conviction by ratting out the other officer, but in the process he lost his job. As far as I know, he never really worked after that. Mr. Stan had tutors of his own. While the older one claimed that she had been preyed upon by him and was suffering from a mental problem as a result of it, the younger one said she was never mistreated in any way. Mr. Stan's wife stood by her husband and claimed that he was innocent of any wrongdoing. I remember that the moment we moved into our house, our next-door neighbor, a kind but nosy old man, immediately told my dad to keep my sister and I away from Mr. Stan no matter what. They filled my parents in on everything of Mr. Stan's history with children, which understandably horrified them both. Mr. Stan was cordial enough on the surface. He would wave hello to my family and do all that neighborly stuff. According to my mom, he would regularly offer to babysit my little sister and I, which my parents emphatically declined. Sometime around 2002 or so, my dad happened to be going to work when he came across a neighborhood child named Lana on her way up the street. My dad's a fairly friendly person, so he asked little Lana what she was up to. She told him she had to go to Mr. Stan's house to give him a back rub, quote-unquote. My dad immediately knew something was off, so he told Lana's parents. To his surprise, they weren't alarmed at all and said that sort of thing happened all the time. When Lana was older, my dad asked her if Mr. Stan had ever acted inappropriately towards her during those visits, and her answer was definitely. I remember when my sister was in kindergarten and I was in grade 3, Mr. Stan's grandkids came to live with him. For reasons I mentioned earlier, my parents couldn't believe this was allowed by anyone, especially considering the allegations and neighborhood gossip around the man. His granddaughter was in the same kindergarten class as my own sister, and his grandson was my age. My mom told me that it was so disturbing to see that sweet little girl at school every day, knowing what might be going on behind closed doors. My parents have always had strong morals, particularly my dad. They would often talk about what they should do. They wanted to report Mr. Stan to the authorities before any harm could come to his grandchildren. My mom and dad knew that if they reported Mr. Stan, they'd be putting themselves at risk. The rest of the neighborhood was of no help at all. My mom said it was as if they were all hiding under rocks and turning a blind eye to what was happening. In the end, they decided the risk of being exposed to report Mr. Stan was worth it. They reported him to the principal at my elementary school, and the principal in turn called the ministry, who sent people to Mr. Stan's house for home visits and investigations. In the end, it was decided that the grandchildren needed to be removed from his home. My mom isn't sure how it happened, but somehow it was leaked that my parents were the ones who reported him. She thinks Lana's family may have had a hand in it. That's when the real fun began, as my mom put it. Mr. Stan was no longer friendly toward my family. No more waves, no more chit-chat. Instead, he would target my mom with his car if she was walking down the road alone, or scream obscenities at my dad. A few times he crossed the center line to scare us if we passed each other while driving. He told my dad that he'd ruined his life and that he was a terrible person. Thinking back on it now, that really makes my blood boil. My dad is one of the kindest and most considerate men I know. Mom was miserable and wanted to move, but Dad, unshakable as he is, said he wasn't in a hurry to do so. Mom told me it took 3 years of house hunting before she finally convinced him it was time to go. Only after all of this, when we had been living in our beautiful new home out in the country, did I finally start to uncover all the details of the story. Sadly, it does not end there. After we moved out, Lana and the other girls, who were now grown up, came forward to report Mr. Stan and what he had done. He was hauled into court for a second time, and this time there was no one to rat out to save himself. The testimony against him was building up. My parents followed the trial in the newspaper. They wanted to see him put away for all the terrible things he'd done. I have no memory of these proceedings, of course, and nobody wanted to explain it to me. I don't blame them. Mr. Stan was not only a former corrections officer, but he was also convicted. He knew he would not last long if he went to prison, so on a quiet morning, 1 week before his sentencing, he took a hunting rifle and blew his own head off. The folks who moved into Lana's house after her family left were walking their kids to school when they heard the shot ring out. Mom tells me the image of that scene still haunts her to this day. I think she imagines what it would have been like if it were her walking my sister and I to school in place of that other family. Maybe she was just disturbed to learn that Mr. Stan had a gun. I know it sounds harsh, but I'm glad he's dead. He can never hurt another person again. My own memories of this whole ordeal are far less interesting than the actual event, but one thing I do remember very clearly is being so afraid of Mr. Stan's house. I knew it was dangerous, though I didn't know exactly why. My sister and I only ever went to his house once. It was on Halloween. My parents decided it was okay for us to trick-or-treat at his house since they would be standing at the bottom of the stairs. I was very reluctant to go. My parents had to encourage me that it was okay. Mr. Stan's house was the only one that didn't need Halloween decorations to be scary. My sister and I cautiously climbed the stairs and rang the doorbell. Mr. Stan's wife opened the door and was very kind and gave us candy. I remember being so surprised that his wife was so nice. What I remember most is that for some reason I decided to look behind Miss Stan, and there was Mr. Stan, a beer-top belly sitting in his armchair watching TV. The room was completely dim except for a single lamp and the glow of the TV, and Mr. Stan didn't even look at us. I remember for years I wondered if that was just what bad men looked like. When I think about this story now, 11 years later, it really hits me how dark my neighborhood was under the surface. It's quite disturbing to me because my childhood was actually quite happy. I was too young to notice anything wrong, and I couldn't sense the tension my parents lived with every day. I didn't know how much potential danger my sister and I were in. All I knew were things like it was a beautiful day to play with my marbles and go out to the lake. Now that I think of it, though, Mr. Stan may have been the reason my parents bought a copy of the You Can Say No book, a picture book that teaches children about safety around bad people. I think my parents handled the situation very well, honestly, and I'm thankful they were attentive and brave during the whole thing. The story could have gone very differently. When I think about our house and that old neighborhood, it's usually happy memories I think of first. My mom tells me that despite all the trouble they went through, neither she nor Dad regret the decisions they made. She left me with one last ominous message about the story. They say every neighborhood has a man just like that living there. Most of the time, we just don't know it so obviously. This happened when I was 14. I was home alone one weekend while my parents were at a work convention out of state. I was in my bedroom, playing Rocket League with two of my friends. To clarify, they weren't in the room with me. I was simply talking to them on my headset during the game. At some point, I thought I heard a thump from downstairs. That wasn't too unusual. I do have two cats who like to wrestle each other sometimes, and they often make a ton of noise while doing so. I assumed that must have been what it was, and resumed my game. I did turn down the volume, though, to hear if the noise would persist. 2 minutes later, I heard another thump, followed by what sounded like a grunt. "Hang on, guys, I think I hear something weird downstairs." They told me to go check it out, and they'd be there waiting when I got back. I began to make my way downstairs, thinking the cats must be wrestling much rougher than they usually do. As I got about halfway down, though, I froze. I could hear what sounded like men whispering to each other, coming from the living room. I crouched down to get a small peek inside, and saw 3 men dressed in all black. I felt my chest sink in when I saw them. I slowly crept back upstairs, and of course, just like in a typical horror film, the very last step made an enormous creak, and the entire house went silent. I knew that they must have just heard me. Thinking on my feet, I quietly went to my room, and through my headset, I told my friends that they needed to call 911 right now. There were 3 men inside my home, and I didn't have time to explain. I then threw my headset on the bed. I could hear footsteps coming up the stairs after me. I had to think fast. I knew that if I locked myself inside my room, they would immediately know where I was. I closed the door to my room and snuck over to my parents' room, leaving that door open so they wouldn't think to check it. I know the logic is flawed, but I had to think very fast. 5 seconds later, I heard a pair of heavy boots against the wooden floor, accompanied by 2 more sets. I heard them get louder as they came down the hall and stopped outside my closed bedroom door. I heard pounding on the door, followed by a deep voice calling out, "Open up, kid, before I take this door down!" I lost my nerve and made a rash decision. I made a break from my parents' bedroom window. I slid it open. I must have made a lot of noise while doing so, because I heard the footsteps immediately come charging toward my parents' bedroom. Now I looked over my shoulder and saw a dark figure in the doorway. "Get back here!" the man yelled as he ran toward me. At this point, I tried jumping out the window, but the man grabbed onto one of my ankles. Luckily, I was able to move my feet and slip out of my shoes. I fell into the small roof above my back porch. The man at the window jumped out after me. I remember seeing a pair of boots coming right at me. I swear the man's feet would have gone right through me if I hadn't rolled off the roof at the last second. I landed awkwardly on my left ankle, but otherwise I was okay. During all the commotion, one of the men had ran downstairs to cut me off. Limping on one foot, I made it to the backyard gate before the man grabbed me and threw me to the ground. I tried to yell, but the man covered my mouth with his hand. The other two men climbed down from the window, and the three of them began to drag me back into the house. Before they could get me through the door, though, I heard the sound of police sirens closing in. The men all looked at each other before they dropped me and ran toward the back gate. I limped my way to the front door and yanked it open. I yelled at the officers that they were in the backyard. 3 of the officers ran towards that area, while another helped me to one of the police cars. They managed to catch one of the assailants, but the other 2 made it over the fence in time. They threw the man into one of the cruisers as I was giving my statement. Soon, the 2 friends I'd been playing with online pulled into the driveway on their bikes as well. They asked me if I was all right, and I thanked them for calling the cops for me. The man that was caught was charged with burglary and attempted kidnapping. Turns out they'd broken in through the basement window. I'm thankful I managed to escape with only a sprained ankle. My lesson to everyone listening is to always follow your gut and to never ignore any strange sounds you hear while home alone. Warning: this experience may not be appropriate for some viewers. Discretion is advised, as this one hits pretty close to the bone. This happened when I was a newlywed. My husband and I went to visit his mother in his rural family home. He said he was from a small town, but it was smaller than I ever imagined it could be. Another reason we headed back to his hometown was because his father was in the hospital. My sister-in-law was a student at the time, so she wasn't home to help. That left his mother essentially home alone. She didn't have a driver's license, so it made getting around the countryside very difficult. She could walk many places, and of course there were buses and taxis, but sometimes you just need a car, don't you? She needed a bunch of gardening supplies. We arrived in the area on the bullet train. My husband would drive his mom around in his father's car. I was planning on going with them, but I suffer from anemia, and I'd almost collapsed on the train. When my mother-in-law saw me, she said I looked too pale to go, and told me I would be better off if I stayed home and rested. I didn't really mind that idea. My husband's room had been left the way it was since he graduated from high school. Same bed, same desk, same everything. I climbed into bed and shut my eyes. Now, I should say that I'm a deep sleeper. I've experienced and slept through earthquakes and come out unscathed. That makes what happened truly shocking. There I was, sleeping soundly on my husband's childhood bed for a while. I began to suddenly feel slightly restless. I put it down to being asleep someplace different. You know, like when you miss the comfort of your own home, or you wake up in the middle of the night at a friend's place, and you're confused. I thought it was a bit like that. I also wasn't used to sleeping alone. When I sensed movement on the bed, I immediately thought that my husband must be back earlier than expected. I dreamily thought he saw me sleeping, and he must have felt like joining me. After a few moments, I felt like something was off though. He was a little more ambitious with what he thought he could get away with at his parents' own home than I thought he would be. I began to wake up more at that point, and I knew immediately something was wrong. I felt something moving beneath the covers, trying to pry at my skirt. I felt a hand parting my legs. I opened my eyes and threw off the covers, and saw there was a random old man on the bed. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. He saw I was awake, and immediately tried to overpower me. I want to feel what a city bitch's body is like. That's what this guy said as he tried to grab at my clothing. At first, I was speechless. I was in a stunned state. I couldn't believe this was happening. I couldn't scream right away, but my brain kicked into gear. I grabbed my phone off the bedside table and immediately dialed the number for the cops. I also kicked the old man with all my might. He went toppling off the bed and hit the wall. I took that as my chance and ran downstairs as fast as I could. I heard the old man cursing at me and saying something else disgusting as he climbed to his feet. I bolted out the front door and ran across the street, where I was immediately spotted by another old guy who was washing his car. I was screaming. It was all so horrible. I screamed at the old man for help, and then I just began to cry. The wife of the guy who was washing his car came out and ushered me into their home to take refuge while I waited for the police to arrive. While I was explaining the situation, my husband and mother-in-law returned home. I was telling the police everything through tear-filled eyes. That was when the old man who'd gotten into bed with me and tried to assault me emerged from the house and just walked off down the street as if nothing had happened. Didn't work out too well for him though, because he was instantly grabbed by the police. Now that my husband and his mother were back, they were able to tell me a few things about the old man. It turned out he lived just up the street on the opposite side. He was living with his two 40-something-year-old sons, who didn't work at all. He didn't work either. Apparently, he had a very young wife, but she didn't live with him anymore. Geez, I wonder why, huh? Turned out he was jealous of my husband and the life he had with me outside of this small town. He told police that because I was from the city and wearing different clothing, I was, quote, glamorous and looked easy to him. He told the police that when he'd broken in, he had committed no crime. He was simply trying to ascertain if I was a hooker or not. Naturally, he was taken away by the police immediately. We were planning on staying the night, but I didn't want to after that. I don't think I was being too difficult wanting to go home right then and there. Before leaving, my husband and his mother informed me that the old man was very important. He was a very important person in their town. I didn't care, though. What that man tried to do would have been irreversible. I was fully prepared to sue this man, but I was asked multiple times to find a more amicable resolution. They kept telling me they wanted a peaceful end to the matter. I was aghast. It wasn't as simple as that. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't get them to see that. In the end, there was no apology, no settlement, and no punishment for the old man. I cried myself to sleep that night. Is that just something that happens in small towns? I hope not. I want to acknowledge right from the start that I realize how dangerous a place like Craigslist can truly be. Even though there are tons of genuine and legitimate postings, I understand that it's still a hotbed of dangerous and horrible humans. I learned this for myself 10 years ago. Even back then, I knew that it wasn't the best place in the world, but I ignored all the horror stories. I honestly was having some pretty good luck on Craigslist. I was making a ton of money, doing side jobs from random postings. I've done everything, from pet sitting to picking up a pizza and delivering it to someone's house. My friends at the time called me crazy for doing all these side jobs, but I was addicted to the hustle. I guess I could say I was bringing home more money than most of my friends. Often the work was pretty easy too. I continued answering the weird ads for several months. I even had my own special vetting process for identifying when postings weren't legitimate. I got myself a cheap track phone that I could use just in case I did deal with some kind of freak. That way they wouldn't have my real number. Like all good things, though, this hustle eventually came to an end. One day, I answered a posting that scared me a little too much, right from the beginning. I should have ignored the posting. It said something along the lines of a secretive gig for big cash. I don't remember exactly what the wording was, but I do remember that it specifically said big cash. This kind of strange wording is usually some creep on the internet looking for something dirty, if you catch my drift. Like I said, I had a vetting process though, so I wasn't going to pass up the chance for some big cash just in case this was legitimate. I clicked on the posting, and of course it was incredibly vague. I got in touch with the person who'd posted the job with my track phone. I was very surprised when a very pleasant woman answered the phone. She was so nice and polite and introduced herself as Lydia. She explained to me what the job was and explained why the posting was so vague. She had made the posting for her elderly grandfather, and he apparently wanted to maintain his privacy. He wanted someone to come over to his home and clean his guns for him. I told her I had no clue how to do something like that, but she told me he would be watching over me, making sure I did everything in the correct way. She told me that she didn't include that information in the ad because she didn't know if it was technically illegal to post about guns on Craigslist. I just want to say that for any gun people out there who may be losing their minds at this point, remember, I didn't know anything about guns at this time, and really I still don't know too much. I didn't know if you needed any sort of training to clean one, and I assumed since the owner would be there, everything would be fine. We agreed on the money. Lydia gave me the address and the day came. I made the drive to the address, given it was only 20 minutes away from my house, but it was still in a very secluded area. The house seemed old and beat up. I knocked on the door, and a very attractive woman answered. I pegged her to be somewhere in her early 20s or so. She introduced herself as Lydia. I could tell right away from her voice that it was the same woman I'd spoken to over on the phone. Just like on the phone, she was very polite and pleasant and guided me through the home. It was honestly a beautiful place. All throughout the house, it had that old-school wood finish, almost looked like a cabin on the inside. As we were walking through the kitchen, Lydia told me I could just throw my stuff on the counter and she would take me to her grandfather. Because she was so bubbly and very chipper, I felt very comfortable and at ease. Without even thinking, I threw my purse right on the counter and continued to follow her down the hall. In the back of her house was a small room filled with all sorts of amazing war memorabilia. It was clear this guy must be a very decorated veteran. While I was looking at all the awards this man had, I heard a loud slam behind me. Lydia slammed the door to the small room and stood in front of the doorway. Next to her was a taller man, and unlike Lydia, he was not good looking at all. His face was dirty, and his hair had that perpetually wet look. Even though it was clearly not wet, I would have to say he was most likely in his early 20s. Realizing the situation I was in was not good, I put up my hands in defense. It didn't matter though. Lydia suddenly charged at me and threw me to the wooden floor. I could see the long legs of the man still standing in the doorway. As I laid on the floor, Lydia began to kick me in the ribs. I remember wanting to fight back, but my body just wouldn't move. Eventually, the kicking stopped. I could feel Lydia's face get close to mine, and she whispered something like, "If you even try to get up, my boyfriend will put you down for good." I stayed on the floor and listened as this Lydia and the tall man left the room. They scurried around the house a little bit, and then after a few minutes I heard 2 car doors shut. Apparently, they peeled away. Figuring it must have been Lydia and her boyfriend who left, I tried to get up off the ground and made my way to the kitchen. My purse that I set on the counter was now gone. That's where I'd had my phone and keys. I looked out the window and saw that my car was also gone. The car that drove out of there was my car. I was freaking out on the inside, but I was trying to keep a level head. I started walking down the road until I reached an old man selling vegetables from a farm stand outside of his house. The man could not have been more of a sweetheart. He gave me food and water, and we called the police together. I reported everything with as much detail as I could. The police found my car about 20 miles away from where this all took place. All the windows were broken out, and the inside of the vehicle was completely slashed and destroyed. Thankfully, my purse was left behind with my ID, but all the money had been stolen. It really wasn't a lot. Turns out I got lucky with the police actually being able to solve this case. Lydia did a great job covering her tracks on Craigslist and making it seem like she was just a shadow. Fortunately for me though, she was also somehow simultaneously a complete moron because she lured me into her actual grandfather's home. He was actually living in Florida for the season, so the house was vacant. Lydia and her boyfriend robbed the house and intended to lure someone there and steal their car. Why they ditched the car so close to the home, I have no idea. They ended up finding this Lydia in a hotel about an hour away from home. She was alone, and from what I understand, she never told the cops who the man was or where he went. In case it wasn't obvious, this was the last job I ever took on Craigslist, and I advise anyone reading this to please be very careful if you do so. When I was in high school, I lived in a 100-plus-year-old house that belonged to the very first mayor of my town, actually. The house had many occupants over the years and had been added on to and renovated many times as well. There was an exceptional amount of creepy shit that went on when I lived there, but this by far stands out in my goosebumps. I was home alone on a regular school night. My mom worked 2 jobs to help support us, so she wasn't home at the time. It was just me and my cat Kringle. About an hour, I'd say, before this event occurred, I'd been in the back dining room walking around, talking on the phone with my girlfriend, and then another friend of mine after. My mom and I barely went into the dining room because it was really just a nice room for show. The room otherwise went completely untouched, especially the dining room table and chairs. Fast forward a bit. I was now down in our den doing some homework. The house was dead quiet when all of a sudden, out of the pure silence, I heard what sounded like furniture being moved around. The house had old hardwood floors, so you could easily make out the screeching. It kept going for 2 minutes or so. I was frozen. My first 2 thoughts were that A, someone was breaking into the house, or B, the cat back there was really fucking around. I realized, however, that B was not an option. I looked down next to my feet and saw the cat was standing up wide-eyed, looking down the hallway that connected my living room to my dining room. I got up slowly, grabbed my pocket knife, and crept toward the back area. My heart was really pounding. I couldn't even breathe. The air got cold, and I had weird chills all over my body. I wanted to turn back and run so much, but something kept propelling me forward. I turned around the corner, and what I saw there I will never forget. When you turn the corner in my old house, you can immediately see the dining room table facing you long ways. Need I remind you that I had just been back there, so everything had been untouched from how it originally was. Well, when I turned that corner, every single chair had been turned around and pulled forward to face my direction, then organized into a single file line. I was so spooked out that I bolted, Kringle still in hand, and ran outside. I called my mom and told her I wasn't going back in there until she got back home. I want you to tell me that ghosts aren't real after that. I frickin' dare you. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with, and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.